This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, and welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Renee Williams, and I'm here with my co-host, Lhotka. Today in studio, we have Cindi Sullivan. Cindi is the Executive Director and President of TreesLouisville. She graduated from the University of Kentucky with a degree in horticulture. She is a certified arborist, and for over 25 years, she hosted a daily television and radio program that focused on horticulture and environment and lifestyle issues. It's a pleasure to have you in studio today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for not saying when I graduated.
Sure, no problem. So today we're going to talk about your work with TreesLouisville. But before we get started, tell us how you got interested in horticulture.
I got interested in horticulture when I was a tiny child. My dad was always a big gardener, and it was so much fun to be able to go out and plant seeds in the soil and watch the plants grow. I think that, of course, everyone feels that people-plant connection. I feel like there are some of us that feel it more strongly than others, and I just have that bug, pardon the pun.
It's totally all right.
So tell us, today we're going to be talking about TreesLouisville, and before we get into that, tell us why trees are important.
Trees are important because they provide a number of ecosystem services to communities. They help improve air quality. They mitigate the urban heat island effect, and we can talk about that. They manage stormwater very well, better than anything. They save people money on their energy bills. They improve property values. They provide all of these ecosystem services. Of course, they sequester carbon. They utilize carbon. But I think for me, most importantly, trees do make people feel better. When you're walking down a tree-lined street, you are much more comfortable than you are when you're walking in the heat of the sun. So I think that the way that trees affect individuals is very important, and the way that trees affect neighborhoods is very important. Trees provide social cohesion. If you've got a front porch that's shaded, you're more likely to be out there looking at and talking to your neighbors. So that provides a really great, byproduct for communities.
So it doesn't matter whether they're in the forest or in an urban setting. Trees basically do the exact same thing no matter where they're located.
Exactly. Yeah, you can forest bathe, right? Shinrin-yoku, or you can enjoy trees in the urban environment. I have to admit, I cross both, right? So I live in a very urban area, but we also have a small piece of property that's about 30 acres of woods, and it's my soul. As soon as we start heading for the lake forest, I just immediately lose all that stress.
So explain to us a little bit about TreesLouisville.
TreesLouisville is a nonprofit organization. We were organized in 2015, and that's not because of the coincidence that, not uncoincidentally, I suppose, that was when the Urban Tree Canopy Assessment for Louisville was published. The Urban Tree Canopy Assessment for Louisville looked at data from 2004, 2008, and 2012. And the study showed that during that 8-year study period, we lost the equivalent of about 54,000 trees each year. That's about 820 acres of trees. And if you're familiar with Louisville, that's 2 of Frederick Law Olmsted's Cherokee parks. It's a huge chunk of our community. And even more alarming than those numbers is the projections for the continued decline of our tree canopy. So we are at about, as of 2012, we were at about 37% canopy, which is not terrible. American Forest recommends about 40% canopy for a really healthy community. But if you take out all of our Olmsted parks, and if you take out the Jefferson Memorial Forest and the parklands, we're at about 30%. That's not good. The 2012 mark didn't really include the losses from the emerald ash borer that Louisville and Jefferson County has experienced that started in Louisville about 2009. So we feel like looking at our aerial imagery data that we have now, that the projections that they made during that study are even more dire right now. So we have a lot of work to do to be able to rebuild our urban tree canopy.
So why would you say that decline happened?
It's a number of reasons. Of course, insects and diseases, the emerald ash borer and various diseases cause problems. We had a number of severe weather events during that 8-year period, an ice storm, a windstorm that had almost hurricane-force winds. There was a bizarre flood, and we lost a lot of trees because of soil saturation, and the trees just fell over. But I think most importantly, we lose more tree canopy to single-family development, building new homes in areas that are in Jefferson County still fully treed. And we still utilize that old cut and clear method of developing subdivisions. And that's where we lose a lot of our tree canopy. And one more thing, attrition has a lot to do with it. In the 50s and early 60s, when a couple would buy a home, the first thing that they would do is plant foundation taxes in the front of the house up close. 2 trees in the front and 1 in the back, because those trees were the air conditioning for those homes. And it was about 1969 that more than 50% of homes and cars were sold with air conditioning. So we lost that sense of value that trees provide that we needed at that time. And so since then, I just think it's kind of dropped off, that front of mind realization that trees are so important. We've kind of lost that, so we haven't been replacing.
I think a lot of people, they look outside, they see a tree, and they just naturally assume that they're always going to be there. What can people do to actually make sure that isn't a reality where they're not there?
We always recommend that if you have an event to celebrate, instead of giving someone a box with a bow, plant a tree.
Oh,
It's something that we can all do. We can't do anything unless we've got tons of money about the rainforest being destroyed in Brazil or the terrible fires in Australia, but we can most certainly walk out into our backyard and plant a tree or give someone a tree. It can be a really meaningful family event, and watching those trees grow over time can be a long-term joy. So easiest thing to do is simply plant a tree.
So earlier you talked about a little bit about the heat island. Can you explain what the heat island is?
In Louisville, Kentucky, we have the dubious honor of being named the fastest warming urban heat island in the United States. And that's because back in 2012, there was a researcher named Dr. Brian Stone, he's still around, that looked at the 50 largest cities in the United States. He looked at the change in temperature per decade for 4 decades for each of those cities. Louisville's change in temperature was 1.67 degrees Fahrenheit. And the next city was Phoenix, Arizona at 0.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Right? So, I mean, he basically had to throw our numbers out because they were really skewing his data. But it made us start thinking,
eye-opener.
We've got a problem, right? And it is, again, because of a number of factors, the topography of Louisville, creates that settling effect. Overall, the urban heat island effect is defined as the difference in temperature between the urban core and the outlying areas. So if you're from Lexington, for instance, and you drive in from Georgetown and work downtown, there's going to be a temperature differential. I don't know what it is for Lexington, but in Louisville, if you live on the outskirts of town and you work downtown and drive in, there can be as much as a 12-degree temperature differential. Because
That's
that downtown, it really is. The built environment holds in that heat, and because we've got big buildings and lots of air conditioning, they create more heat, and it just doesn't go away. Versus the transpiration in the outlying areas, because there are more trees there and more grass and all of that, the temperatures will fluctuate more.
So how can trees then help that situation?
If you think about what a tree canopy actually is, it's, the leaves and the stems and the branches that create basically an umbrella. And so trees can help to mitigate the urban heat island effect simply because of the fact that they provide shade. And they transpire. They take moisture from the soil and it comes out, at the top. I mean, I'm sounding like a fourth grader, but
That's okay.
Trees help us breathe.
Right.
So that's a huge advantage for having a robust tree canopy for a community.
So talking about schools and fourth graders, we were going to ask about projects that you work with schools.
We have established a fantastic partnership with the Jefferson County Public School System. The Jefferson County Public School System, a lot of people don't realize, is the 27th largest public school system in the United States. They have about 175 facilities. 150 something are actually schools. And unfortunately, I think kind of back to that attrition thing, when most schools are built, and you can look at any community, when most schools are built, there's a building and there are grounds, but unfortunately, maybe the money has run out or maybe they just didn't plan for it, but there's not much landscaping. And that is certainly the case at the Jefferson County Public School System. So we developed this partnership with JCPS where we raise money to buy trees, create designs, and we do work with the University of Kentucky Department of Landscape Architecture to help to have students come and look at our sites and do designs for us in the studio, and then we implement those designs. We get pro bono work from landscape designers, and we do our own design work too, because we're tree people. We love doing that stuff. So we raise the money for the trees, acquire the trees, we do the design, we install the trees, and then the Jefferson County Public School System maintains the trees. It has really been an amazingly successful project and program for us. And I think it's because the administration really gets it. I mean, there are studies that show that students that are exposed to natural areas perform better on tests. They exhibit better behavior. They suffer less from symptoms of ADHD. They're more focused. They get better grades. So having these natural areas on these school campuses is incredibly beneficial. Because again, there's so much documentation that proves that. Lots of school systems are starting to do a better job of creating healthier, more environmentally friendly environments to learn and grow. And it's not just a benefit for the students and the teachers at the school. Our school system provides community assets. I mean, these are playgrounds and open areas and game fields that the entire surrounding community uses. So it's a benefit for the entire neighborhood as well as the entire community. So we feel like it's really a signature program for us that has been incredibly successful, and successful in a number of different ways, because we work with the grounds people to make sure that they understand the importance of these living beings and what they do to take care of them. So it's been amazing. And we also have, amazingly enough, a Trees Louisville science unit in every single 8th grade science class in the Jefferson County Public School System.
And so what did they do during those units?
We provide them with an arborist tape, which is, it has a regular measuring tape on one side, but an arborist tape actually does the calculation to determine diameter, so you don't have to use pi r squared.
Right.
And it has a tree guide so that the students can learn to identify what type of tree. So they go out to their schoolyard, they can identify the tree, measure the size of the tree, and then we provide them with a manual that has online tools that they can use then back in the classroom to determine the value of the ecosystem services that tree provides. It's a very real-life, hands-on sort of experience that I think brings about a lot of appreciation for that tree in the schoolyard.
So how long has this program been going on?
Trees Louisville started in 2015, and that's really when we sort of kicked off our partnership with JCPS, and we've been at it every year since, every planting season.
So how many trees have you planted?
We feel like we're upwards of 10,000.
Oh my.
Oh yeah,
That's great.
We're not messing around.
Right.
Yeah, we've got a lot of work to do, and I'm old, so I want to get this done. So we've increased the number of trees every year since we've been around, but plant landscape-sized trees. We do a lot of distributions where we give away manageable sized trees, 1 gallon, 3 gallon, 5 gallon containers. We do a lot of 7 and 15 gallon plantings as well. And everybody likes to take home a seedling every once in a while, so we do some smaller tree giveaways as well.
Right. Does the kids get involved in the plantings as well?
They do, and it really does depend on the school. We have schools where the kids will come out and help us plant. We'll have schools where they'll come out and watch. We have schools where the teachers will utilize the trees. For instance, I mean, when you've got in the springtime all the diversity, and we do make it a really substantial effort to make sure we're planting lots of diversity on all of these campuses, because we think that that's something that's really important. So you can look at the different shapes of the leaves, the different colors in the fall, the different bark textures, and a lot of the teachers are taking advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah, that'll allow them an outdoor classroom, basically.
Exactly.
That's right.
Yeah.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we'll talk about this animal and why it is making that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. So do you have suggestions for other cities that might be interested in having similar programs or getting involved, kind of increasing their tree canopy?
Or even getting started.
Yeah.
Well, I think that it really does take some strong support. One of the things that I joke about when I took this job, I thought I was going to be planting trees. But in order to plant the number of trees that we need, you've got to raise a lot of money. So I think that it's very important to have, I hate using the term, but the movers and the shakers of a community to understand the value of the community forest and how much it matters to the future of our communities. So I think having involvement of civic leaders and having very passionate people that do understand and that have that people-plant connection and they're willing to get their hands dirty is important as well. So I call it TreesLouisville synchronicity. It seems like for us, we just had these things that sort of just fell into place. So we've been very lucky. It's almost hard to describe how many things we've been able to accomplish since we started in 2015. But it's totally doable. And I think you just have to take that first step and get started.
Can you kind of explain to our listeners the differences between Lexington and Louisville? Because I don't know that everybody is quite familiar with, the sizes and populations and that kind of thing.
So that's an interesting question for me because I grew up in Lexington.
Oh, okay.
And then I moved to Louisville when I was newly married, and had my first children. So feel like they're both home. Right? But I didn't realize what a small community Lexington really is until I moved to Louisville. Louisville is geographically larger and the population is larger. But culturally, we're, I think, maybe a little bit more diverse, and so there's, I don't know, it just seems like there's a lot more going on, right? And we've got more to pull from. What's interesting when you talk about and I love both places, obviously. My mom is still here, so I'm here in Lexington all the time. And, of course, I am a UK guy, so
there you go.
I go to all the basketball games and the football games, too. So we're here a bunch. it's still home, right? But interestingly, when you compare the tree canopy of Louisville and Lexington, it's almost like apples and oranges. Lots of cities have had urban tree canopy assessments done, and the one that was done in Louisville looked at the entire county. So it's about 400 square miles of area. Lexington's urban tree canopy only looked at the urban core, basically, so maybe 25 square miles or something. So Lexington's numbers look a lot lower, but it doesn't really include the rest of Fayette County. So it's a really unfair comparison in that regard. But we're lucky to have these two urban areas. And when I say Northern Kentucky as well is a great place to be and holds a lot of the culture of Kentucky.
So do other cities have a trees, whatever city it is?
There are, and that's one of the things that was kind of easy for Trees Louisville to get going is there are lots of tree, insert name, right? So Trees Philly, Trees Atlanta, Trees Charlotte helped us so much getting started with our 1023, which is something that we had to do to be able to get our 501c3 nonprofit status. And there is an annual conference called the Partners in Community Forestry that is hosted by the Arbor Day Foundation. And that conference brings together urban foresters and utility foresters and all sorts of nonprofit people, professional people to come together and talk about what we need to be doing, whether you're a small rural community or a larger urban area, to make sure that we are preserving and enhancing our urban tree canopy. And interestingly, that Partners in Community Forestry Conference will be in Louisville in November of 2020.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Do you have events throughout the year as well?
Because we are a very small staff, we really don't do a lot of events. I am so envious of Lexington because you guys have Tree Week and you've got the Urban Forest Initiative and you host all these great speakers and events. I mean, it's just fabulous. But for some reason, and maybe again it's that cultural thing, you guys are gatherers more maybe. We haven't really gone into that realm. But you know what? I think we'll get there.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about some of the other partners that you work with?
That's a really good question because we wouldn't be able to do all of the things that we do if we didn't have the synergy of other partners and other collaborators. And I mentioned the Jefferson County Public School System, which is huge, but we also have a partnership with the Kentucky Department of Transportation. We have in District 5, so that's where the Louisville District is, it's several counties around Louisville. District 5 works with us very closely. We have done some demonstration projects where we've actually planted trees on the rights-of-way of the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. So that has turned out to be a super partnership because it's about economics, but it's also about the environment. And I think the engineers at KYTC understand how important it is to have that tree canopy to intercept the particulate matter along the roadways to help manage stormwater a little bit better. So that's become a super partnership. And what we're working on now is trying to figure out how we can reduce mowing. If we would just reduce mowing along our rights-of-way, we would be able to create an environment where trees would succeed by succession. And we would have more wildflowers and more pollinators and more activity, of bees and butterflies and such. So we really feel like that's an important initiative to promote, not just in the Louisville area, but for the entire state of Kentucky. So that has been a very rewarding partnership, and we're looking to expand that too. So that's one of the things that's really great. We also work with our Metropolitan Sewer District. Of course, their mission is clean, safe waterways. And what better ways to improve waterways than to plant more trees? We work with them with their urban reforestation program and plant trees for them. And we've also helped them revise some of their policies for where trees are allowed to be planted, right? So if you've got a detention basin, there's no reason that trees couldn't be planted there instead of leaving it just a a hollow shell. So we really are making some inroads, I think, with some of the utilities that, again, that's a replicable thing. All communities could do that. I think maybe one of the most important things that your listeners should understand is we're not going to be able to improve our community tree canopies and improve our ecosystem services if we don't have strong public policy. So legislators, policymakers need to understand, again, the value of the community forest. If you think about it, we talk about road work. We talk about our sewers. We talk about the infrastructure. But trees that's not top of mind. Trees need to be considered an essential part of our infrastructure, not just the green infrastructure, an essential part of our infrastructure. And until we take that leap, we're not going to be able to get to where we need to be. There are some really unfortunate policies in place now in the Louisville area. For instance, if you have a new development and you've got 100 acres of forested land, you're not required to save any of those trees as of today. Hopefully that will change soon. But that's not sustainable. That is not sustainable practice. So we've got to do a better job of public education and engagement and really get our policymakers in front of this problem.
I know in Lexington, homeowners, if they have something happen to a street tree or if it dies on the street, they're responsible for replacing that. Does that happen the same?
It does. Okay. And that's a fairly recent phenomenon, which we're really happy about. We do have a public tree protection ordinance, and that is, the public right-of-way in Louisville is only 30% of plantable land. So if you do lose a tree in the right-of-way that's adjacent to your home, it is your responsibility to replace that tree within a year. And you have to get the stump ground out within 3 months, I think, too. But take that a step further, that's just, again, 30% of plantable land. The real measure that we can make, the real difference that we can take is planting that other 70%. And that's all our private property. So that's what we really need to be, that's where we really focus at Trees Louisville, a lot of our efforts.
And so how do you let homeowners know which tree to plant and where and when? Do you communicate with them about that information?
We on our website, we feel like it's a pretty robust educational piece. There's lots of information about not just the trees that are approved or not approved for planting in Jefferson County by Louisville Metro government, but we've got a list of our favorite trees, because again, we're tree geeks.
Right.
And we do that by size too. If you've only got a small yard, you would, you probably want to have a redbud or a yellowwood or a dogwood or something like that. And then there's medium-sized trees, and then there's larger trees. So we separate them out like that as well. We've got lots of instructions on how to properly plant a tree. We do volunteer events where we show people how to plant trees, and even more importantly, maybe for the long term, pruning trees. You can't just put a tree in the ground and walk away.
Right.
You got to make sure it gets well established. And you've got to make sure it's got long-term maintenance to make it strong.
So you've presented us with a lot of great information today. And what would be one or two takeaway items that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I'll give you one. Plant a tree.
It's good advice.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you, Cindi, for joining us today. We greatly appreciate you being on our show. And if you'd like more information on what you've heard today, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned now for another episode of Extension Notes. You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview.
Okay, we're back once again doing an extension notes, and in studio today we have Lori Thomas, and she is a forester in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Glad to have you in the studio today.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about what is an acorn.
Well, the acorn is it's the fruit of the oak tree, and it's also called a nut. And you'll notice if you're walking around campus, you may be seeing a lot of these acorns on the ground.
Or get hit by one.
Yes, or get hit by one. Yeah, exactly. But it is a nut, and it contains a single seed. Rarely are there two seeds in there, but it's got kind of a a leathery outer shell, and it's got a little cap on top of them, the little acorn cap. It looks like a little hat or beret. Acorns vary in size and shape, and so do their caps depending on the species. Like for a red oak type tree might have a smaller, just a little woody beret cap on top, and maybe be elongated, kind of an oblong acorn, anywhere from 1 to 6 centimeters long. Or you may run into a bur oak, which is a common tree around here. We've got several on campus, which has a much larger acorn, almost like you fit in your palm, and it's got a great big cap on it, almost completely covers the nut with a big frill around it, like it's got little fuzz all the way around the edges of it, so it looks like it's got a very fancy cap. So acorns, those nuts, they vary depending on the species of the oak tree. So some of them are really neat, and see them, you can see squirrels going after them and whatnot. So
what about color?
Color on acorns will vary too. I know there'll be a much lighter greenish or a lighter tan in color, and some will be, like we've got an oak tree out in front of the Forestry building. It's a very almost mahogany color acorn out there, so they'll vary in color as well. So yeah, they're kind of neat. Some are shiny, some look like they've got fuzz on them too.
How long do they take to become acorns?
That varies. That's a good question. So think about it in a growing season. You got January. Think of your calendar. January, as we start moving into spring, leaves start to develop. Flowers on the oak tree will start to develop. And the flowers on oak trees are different, not your typical flower. I will say this too, that an oak tree has, a single tree will have both male and female flowers on it. I mean, that term, the scientific term for that is monoecious. But the male flowers, like I said, they don't look like typical flowers. It's kind of a long droop, call it a catkin, and it has several small blooms on it. And then the female flowers, like you need to get a magnifying glass out to find that. So not typical flowers at all, but those flowers form in the spring, pollination occurs, and then acorns start to develop. Depending on if it's in the white oak or the red oak group, white oak acorns will mature in this growing season from spring until fall, and then they'll drop those acorns. Now red oaks, on the other hand, it'll take 2 growing seasons. So they develop this year, they'll stay on the tree and they won't fall. It takes 24 months for those acorns to mature and then drop to the ground. And another neat thing, the difference between red oak and white oak acorns, once they drop in the fall, if it's a white oak tree and it's dropped its acorns, those acorns will start to germinate or, start to develop roots and whatnot, sink them into the ground and germinate now, whereas red oak acorns, the ones that have dropped this fall, will actually overwinter on the ground. They won't germinate until the following spring. And there's benefits and disadvantages, as you can imagine, to both. If for the white oak acorn, they germinate now, you have a really tough winter, it could kill it. Its roots doesn't have a good root system developed. Whereas the red oak acorns, it's hung around all throughout the winter and leaves it susceptible to, rodent damage or potentially insect damage late in this season or early next spring too. So yeah, there's a lot of differences between the red oak and the white oak acorns.
As far as the acorns, what eats them?
What eats them? Okay, well, they are a mast. It's called acorns, along with other nuts, are termed mast. Which we talk about mast. I think Dr. Matt Springer referred to mast when he was talking about wildlife. Very important wildlife food. Mast is simply a term that is the fruit of the tree or a shrub. And mast can be broken down into 2 types. There's hard mast, which acorns, hickory nuts, beech nuts, things that have a hard exterior, that would be a hard mast type fruit. And then there's soft mast, which would be something like an apple or a raspberry or like cherry or things like that. It's got that soft, fleshy exterior. But for acorns, being a hard mast, it is an extremely important wildlife food, especially in areas where oaks occur. And we have an oak hickory forest here in Kentucky. All kinds of animals eat acorns. They're really important in the diet of a variety of birds: blue jays, turkeys, bobwhite quail, crows, and ducks such as mallards and our wood duck. They all consume and have a portion of their diet is made up of acorns, along with several woodpeckers too. So we have a variety of woodpeckers here in the state. There's a lot of mammals, too, that eat acorns, such as little mice, squirrels, chipmunks, all kinds of small rodents. It's an important part of their diet, as well as large mammals, too. Bears and deer also eat acorns. On good mast years where there's been a lot of acorns produced, it's estimated that 25% of the diet of deer could be made up of acorns. So a very important part of their diet.
So you said good mast year. So is there bad mast years, I guess?
I don't know that it's actually would be a bad mast year, but acorns, a tree doesn't produce a big bunch of acorns every single year. It's usually, depending on species, every 2 years, every 4 years. Some trees, it's more very cyclical, like every 2 to 4 years, they'll have a big mast year, produce lots of acorns. And then those intermittent years, they may still have some acorns, but it'll be far fewer than normal. So yeah, that's what when we talk about a good mast year versus a bad mast year. Just an abundant crop of acorns versus not an abundant crop of acorns.
I know you mentioned a lot of the animals that eat them. Why do they eat them? What's in it?
That's a good question. And actually, Native Americans have eaten, not just animals eat them, but they have been an important diet in Native Americans' diet and other places where there are oaks in other parts of the world. But acorns are very nutrient rich. They've got a large amount of protein, carbohydrates, and fats in them, as well as minerals such as calcium, phosphorus, and potassium. So they're kind of it's a nut that's packed full of all kinds of good stuff, which is important for wildlife. Trying to get that in their diet is building up their fat stores for the winter and whatnot. But yeah, so they're very nutrient rich and important for wildlife.
Yeah, early this year, Matt did one on acorns falling off of a tree, and he was saying that they're very bitter if you were to taste them.
Yes, they are. And so you've got red oak type trees, and then there's white oak type trees. It's just kind of a general grouping. We got lots of different kinds of white oaks and lots of different kinds of red oaks or species of that. And generally speaking, red oak acorns tend to have far more tannins. They're much more bitter or astringent, even for wildlife. But if we were to eat them, they would taste much more bitter than the white oak acorns if we were to, mash those down and make a meal or something out of them. Because white oak acorns have fewer tannins in them, they're still bitter, but not nearly as bitter as the red oak acorns, which is, tend to be wildlife will go for the white oak acorns to start off with because they're less bitter. Exactly, yeah.
When an acorn falls off a tree and then it could turn into a tree eventually. How do they get distributed? Because you don't see a whole lot of other little oaks coming underneath these big oaks. So what happens there?
So seed dissemination or dispersal. For acorns, it can be a variety of ways. If a tree's near a water source, it's obviously going to move down the water source. But, if it's not, you've got a little bit of small wind dissemination, but think about it, it's a pretty heavy nut. A lot of your dispersal agent is going to be the wildlife, going to be those squirrels, those rodents that have moved these around and maybe buried them, thinking that animal will come back for it again later in the winter, looking for their little cache of nuts out there.
Maybe not found it.
Right, so they're dispersed a lot by wildlife, the acorns are. Okay. So wildlife's important for eating them and also dispersing them.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. Acorns are, obviously very important for wildlife. Acorns have been around. They were part of mythology. There's oak trees in Europe. There's oak trees in other parts of the world. I've seen this in people's email signature that great oaks from little acorns grow. And that's an old English proverb. And it symbolizes patience because acorns develop on adult trees. So you've got to wait for that tree to grow into an adult and have that patience for that acorn to grow. So it's just I think it's a neat kind of little English proverb that great oaks from little acorns grow, urging that listener to wait for the maturation of a project or an idea or something. So, so it's been around. Mythology with our acorns have been around, even in the Norse legends. Thor supposedly was sheltered from a thunderstorm under an oak tree, which led to the belief that having an acorn in a windowsill will prevent a house from being struck by lightning. And I don't know if you've ever noticed that there's a lot of window blinds and decorations, they'll have acorns on them and the finials and stuff up in the corner. And especially in older homes, you might notice it, and that molding around there, there'll be little acorns in there, and it's just part of old legends, that it's protection, right, that it's a protection, for the house. So it's, acorns have been important to us and to wildlife for a very long time.
Yeah. You're talking about signatures. I have that on my signature.
That's where I've seen it.
Yeah, right.
I've seen it.
It's like a mighty oak was just a little nut that stood its ground.
Right, exactly.
So, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for coming in and talking about acorns.
All right. Thank you.
Stay tuned now for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. I'm Dr. Matt Springer, Assistant Extension Wildlife Professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Before I tell you what that sound was you heard at the beginning of the show, let's play it again for you.
All right, that was really high pitched.
It is. It's very high pitched, and there's a reason for that. It's because that bird is in usually dense young cover, and it's trying to get that sound to carry through it, so it can potentially reach a mate or tell a neighboring competitor that this is my ground, stay away, right? And that's our prairie warbler.
Okay.
And the funny thing is, we're here and we have a guest, and we're going to continue our series. And Zach Danks is here from Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, our rough grouse and turkey coordinator. Talking, we were talking about young forests here the last couple shows, and we picked this species out because a lot of times people hear the name prairie warbler and think grassland. Well, honestly, as Zach pointed out, they're one of the species that keys in quite a bit on young forests. And that's because a lot of the structural components of a young forest are very similar to a grassland. That successional stage of growth, right? If you let a grassland go, it's going to be a forest.
And grow up.
Yeah, it's going to turn into a forest. So it just so happens that grasslands have a lot more disturbance on a regular basis, usually with fire. But, that habitat structure from a young forest is what that prairie warbler is looking for. So there they are.
Yeah, think of a pasture that you pulled the cows off for 10 years or so, and it's growing up. Cedar trees, there's vines, honeysuckle, saplings of all sorts. That structure really is going to support the prairie warbler more than a prairie of just solid grass. So they're really unique species. But that sound is, it's not something you're going to hear from far away. And honestly, it's not something you're probably going to hear if you are hard of hearing. But if you're lucky enough to still have your hearing, they're a true treasure when you hear it. Because if you're in the right spot and you hear it and you look up, you might see it at eye level. Great example. I was traveling up I-64, the Farmer's Shark exit near Moorhead. I pull off the side of the road because I saw a wildflower I wanted to look at. It was right off the exit. And there was scattered cedar trees, scattered grasses, things. But I heard a prairie warbler, and I looked up, and I saw it dancing about eye level on these branches of these things. So if you happen to hear it, you can notice it. And, man, these things are warblers, wood warblers like this, are like little jewels when you see them, and the prairie warbler is one of them. So they're here for the spring and summer to breed and rear young, and then they head south for the fall and winter. They spend the winter in Mexico and the Caribbean. So really neat birds. So it's a unique sound and nice tie to the habitat.
So what do they look like color-wise?
They're generally yellow, and they've got some rufous or reddish colors on them, and maybe some white and gray too. Little cap of, it's kind of like a brownish,
coffee-ish color.
Right, kind of olive-ish color, maybe on the back of their neck and sides, and they got eye rings and little black stripes going off their cheeks. Really hard to explain. And
decorative bird.
Decorative.
They are worth Googling to look at.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Google prairie warbler, they're worth it. Yeah. And there's a lot of closely related species that look pretty
very
similar.
Yeah.
So that's why it's important to know the sounds of the forest. Because you can bird by ear, in many cases, more effectively than you can bird by sight, especially if you don't have binoculars or if, like me, you can't see very far without my glasses or contacts.
About how big are they?
Oh, they're tiny. They're
Okay.
smaller than a cardinal. So they're like sparrow size or
Sparrow,
lighter.
robin? Oh, okay.
Yeah, probably lighter weight than a robin, or a sparrow, sorry, but generally sparrow size.
They're tiny.
Like chickadee size.
Yeah, chickadee would be
Chickadee
a good,
size,
yeah,
okay.
one that people would know for sure.
So,
And do they make nests in trees or?
yeah, I think they're sort of a mid-canopy nester.
Okay.
Don't quote me on that.
Yeah,
But
they're looking for structure. So they're not nesting on the ground or in grasses. They're looking for some structure, potentially that bush or slightly older tree, if I remember correctly. So
Yeah,
All right. Well, thanks for coming in and talking about them.
sure.
Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and of course via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to wrfl.fm/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.